Universal childcare programs are seen by many as the answer to challenges faced by many working parents. But is it really the best solution? Today's guest may not really see it that way. Andrea Mrozek is the program director for the think tank Cardis, which has come out with a new policy paper entitled A Positive Vision for Childcare Policy Across Canada. Andrea, welcome back to Bridge City News.
Thanks for having me.
Universal childcare programs are being promoted fairly heavily by various government bodies across the country. Now, they say it's really needed in order to help out single moms, working families. But let me first of all ask, which provinces currently have universal daycare available?
So there's only one province that has a so-called universal childcare system, and that's Quebec. They've had it since 1997, and it started at $5 a day, and the costs have increased from there. But that would be the only province, is the province of Quebec, to officially have this idea of a universal system.
So why don't we see more of it in other provinces like here in Alberta or in Ontario where you are?
It's something that childcare activists have been fighting for probably 40 years. And I think we don't have it because parents don't actually want it. It tends to be the least popular choice. And I think somewhere deep down, politicians and the powers that be are aware that this isn't actually a popular thing with families. So that's part of the reason why we don't have it. It continues to linger in the background as an option, which is of grave concern to me. And that's why we put out this positive vision for childcare that hopefully will avoid the pitfalls of universalism.
Now, would it be better for the government to make a variety of options available for parents?
So ultimately, what we hope to see is an opening up of the childcare sector that would allow parents to make choices that they'd like to make. And that includes whether they'd like to have a parent stay home. A lot of parents will tag team with a spouse or with grandparents and family members. Other parents will use friends in the community, home daycares in the neighborhood close by. And ultimately, the surveys and polls are remarkably consistent in showing that center-based care, which is what the government puts on offer, is the least popular choice. So I can't emphasize that quite enough. But there are very many levers that the government has to offer families solutions and possibilities that are more equitable than just offering one type of care.
So Andrea, what would the different needs of childcare for a rural community be as compared to larger municipal centers?
Well, you raise a good point with that, which is the fact that it is a very local issue and that people who are working on a farm, for example, in a rural community will have different needs than in a city. Even within the city, however, we see different needs. You have a nurse, for example, doing shift work. You have people who are working in a mall. And so whether it's urban or rural, what we see is a diversity of needs that generally are not met by the type of care that governments are able to produce.
Now, when we think of daycare, we usually assume that maybe it starts at the kindergarten age, but I'm seeing governments advocating for younger ages, like kids age 3 or 4. Does that present some unique challenges?
You're actually a bit late on that. I just went to a major conference here in Ottawa run by the government where they talked about the needs for childcare beginning at birth. And I don't know how they're defining childcare, but they'd like to see the spaces accessible from birth forward. So there really has been a movement to go younger and younger. Kindergarten generally starts age 4 or 5. Here in Ontario, you can have 3-year-olds also in kindergarten. And the movement on the political front is really to push childcare into the school system. So childcare activists are very happy to attach it to kindergarten and push the kindergarten age downwards. But what they want to see is not for 3 and 4-year-olds. What they'd like to see is a space available for 1-year-olds so that when generally many women will take a year maternity leave, that there would be spaces available at 1 year of age, and that's the goal.
Now, some parents would prefer faith-based care centers, while others prefer more of a secular approach. Is that something governments would really consider and even accommodate?
I think their parents need to look to the public education system and examine in their province and their jurisdiction how accessible faith-based learning is for the primary school sector and grades 1 and up. And if you have choice in that sector, you may find you get choice in the childcare sector. I know Alberta and Edmonton in particular used to have diversity in their school system, but I think times are changing, and some faith-based schools are getting pushed out or getting told what they can or can't teach at risk of their funding, et cetera. So it's a dicey time, I think, and the problem I think with the government is it's one source of funding and it's one source of care, and it's unrealistic to expect that they would be able to embed tremendous diversity into that.
So, what does the research specifically say about the quality of care in government funded daycare?
It's very poor, actually. The research is on quality, first, I should say, is difficult. We don't have real quality standards, and it's difficult to measure it consistently. Again, at the conference I just attended, many of the child care community were saying we need to have a better way of measuring quality. When we do measure quality and we use things like the National Longitudinal Survey of Children and Youth, we find that the outcomes are actually very poor on a lot of measures. So child vocabulary in Quebec, for example, is neutral. Behavioral problems are worse, they're negative. And interestingly, they found that parenting practices were worse, and that's attributed to the fact that parents don't have as much time to spend with their children after they begin to use a childcare system such as the universal one offered in Quebec. So it's very discouraging, actually, to see that the quality is quite low.
So, who's actually paying for the universal childcare in Quebec then? The taxpayers? And are they happy about it? They must be. I mean, it's been implemented since what, 97?
Well, I don't know that Quebec voters and citizens got too much of a choice. It was rushed in 1997, and that's maybe part of the problem with the quality, that it was done very ad hoc and poorly. Certainly some childcare activists would point to that. It's a very expensive program. There's one research study suggesting that it pays for itself and then some. I raise an eyebrow to that study because I think part of the reason why we don't replicate these programs across the country is because they are so expensive. And what we just talked about, the poor quality in Quebec, points to the fact that although the cost of that program has increased by something like 800%, and they're putting more and more money into it, the quality remains very low. And so what we understand from this is that to have a truly quality system that really does well by our children, we'd have to be spending even more, and that's not sustainable, to use a popular word.
So, Andrea, if the government was to put the money directly into the hands of parents and let them choose how to use it for childcare, would there be enough money available to actually make significant difference for parents?
Well, and this is where the debate should rest, and how much money is enough money, and how are we helping parents, and what are we doing to help parents truly raise their families. I firmly believe that money in a parent's pocket is going to be better spent, and that parents will then make reasonable choices based on what works for their family. But the dollar value is a significant discussion to have. How much will that be? I know I just learned a bit about Hungarian family policy, where they're giving extraordinarily high dollar values to parents. I don't see that coming to Canada anytime soon, but the question is a very valid one about how we support families and whether we actually make their lives easier or not. Of course, I firmly believe that a universal system only helps some and makes everyone's lives tougher in the end.
Now, one of your recommendations is to build on the very successful Canada Child Benefit and as well maybe simply lower taxes. Tell me more about that.
Right. So any number of different levers exist. If you're a more left-wing government, you might choose to give way more money to parents as a handout is the word that comes to mind, but just money to spend in their pockets. The tax cut option would be something that actually could work as well, where parents with children don't pay any taxes. I might advocate for that if we consider how high taxes are. That could be a way of helping families to ease their finances and the difficulties of raising children. In the report, Positive Vision for Childcare, we mentioned a number of other interim options that go between the sort of those types of extremes. Of course, you can decrease taxes incrementally also. It doesn't have to go from high taxes to no taxes.
So, what kinds of daycare models are being used by other countries around the world? You mentioned Hungary earlier there. Now, are there any success stories that we can maybe learn from?
The thing with the development of childcare, we mostly are looking to OECD nations, which are Organization Economic Cooperation and Development nations, and many of them are in Europe, and European culture and tradition leads to a more a centralized government approach, and they tend to have systems that are so-called universal systems. But even within that context, you see variance, and we need to make sure that if we lean at all in that direction, that we, for example, we look more to a country like Finland, where they have at least monies going to parents in the first 3 years of life. They also have the spaces available in center-based care, but they don't limit their family policy to center-based care. So if Canada is even going to dabble in the so-called universal world of childcare, one of our recommendations is to think Finland, not Sweden. In Sweden, they don't have those benefits for parents. They just have the system, and the outcomes for children are not very good.
Now, you also suggest the government's work on increasing the flexibility of parental leave. Let's talk more about that.
We're basically in favor of anything that increases flexibility and choice for families, understanding that each family is unique. So if there's any further flexibility that can be added into parental leave that would allow people to, for example, do a little bit of work while on leave, that kind of thing would offer, I think, greater options and ease family stress and strain. And thinking about lengths of maternity leave and how people can use it in different increments, all that sort of thing is a conversation that we may not be having enough of. So there are a lot of levers in family policy and a lot of good discussion to be had. And again, I think flexibility and choice are key.
So apparently in some provinces, there's a deliberate strangling of the private sector, which results in a decrease in spaces and choices. So perhaps some regulatory changes are needed?
Yeah, there's a group that popped up in Ontario as a result of the direct and deliberate strangling of that independent childcare sector. And so that group of home daycare providers decided to advocate for themselves and come together. It's almost incomprehensible why you would strangle that sector. Here in Ontario, where I live, it really did eradicate something like close to 80,000 spaces for children. And those were popular spaces that, it's the sort of neighborhood home daycare type environment. But at that particular political juncture, there was a real hostility to any kind of independent care. So it's important, I think, to keep those options open again.
Now, another recommendation being considered is changing the requirements to become a qualified early childhood educator. Can you explain that?
Well, we do have a labor shortage, particularly in the childcare sector. And I define childcare as the care of a child, no matter who does it. Oftentimes, people think exclusively of the professionals. When we get into the professional zone, we find a real shortage of people to offer the type of care that parents would want to use. So I think things can be done there to free up that sector, and that's something that the independent childcare providers of Ontario were really concerned about and contributed that recommendation to the report. But it's hard to find good staff in childcares, and there's things we can do to ease the labor supply side there.
So looking ahead, what kind of changes do you realistically see taking place over the next few years?
I think realistically, we can stave off a universal approach. We can keep things in the hands of the provinces. We can keep it close to where parents are living. That would mean even going municipal. I think we can redefine childcare to mean the care of a child, no matter who does it. And that can include your family members or parents. Basically, I think I have realistic expectations around what it is that governments across the country can choose to do on this file. It is a highly, highly politicized issue, so it definitely depends what government comes into power in various provinces. But that push and pull is important in a democracy anyway.
Andrea Mrozek, Program Director for the think tank Cardis, thanks a lot for joining me today from Ottawa.
Thank you so much for having me.